Games as Lit 101. For the next 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about one of the most abused and misunderstood artistic traditions of our day: adaptation. To start off, we're going to have to define it, because the concept suffers a lot of misrepresentation. Our culture is obsessed with adapting art in various ways. We want to adapt a story into another medium. We want to try recreating an image using a different art style. We want to retell a classic story with more modern sensibilities and cultural contexts. Some would argue that it's a sign of growing artistic unoriginality, but however much of that there may be, I would disagree. At its heart, adaptation is about bringing a story from one context into another. Note that it is called adaptation, not reproduction or something. We're not trying to just recreate something exactly the way it was. Rather, the idea is to adapt something into an entirely different and new context. That new context can be anything ranging from a different artistic medium, or a different culture, or even just a different time period. To quote one of my favorite online movie critics, Kyle Calgren, stories gain power in their retelling. Stories are told and retold, and the ways they shift and change at the whims of different cultures and artists is fascinating. All that to say, adaptations are not just meritless reproductions of previous work. They're reimaginings of classic stories, tailored to the creator's interpretation, presented to a new audience, and sometimes altered to suit a new artistic medium. The adapter must have a strong and nuanced understanding of the original story to make this work, and if they're adapting it into another medium entirely, then it requires an equally strong understanding of how that medium works. Art is both a representation of culture as well as a shaping force for it. It's a product of the struggles and interests of its time and helps affect change in its culture even while it reflects it. Seeing the same story told across a bunch of different cultures can say a lot about each of them. So for instance, when you see Laurence Olivier's film adaptation of Henry V, you don't see much that would cast Henry in a less heroic light. Some of his more questionable decisions and morally gray choices were removed or downplayed. This is because the film was made in 1944 and was intended as a historical war epic that would boost morale in wartime. We see that though it's based on a Shakespearean play, it still served that vital function of art by adapting itself to its cultural environment. And it was pretty great too. Now, of course, that's one purpose of adapting a story, and it generally tends to happen with adaptations that are made in a very different society or time period than the original story. But there is another kind of adaptation, one that simply seeks to transpose a story from one medium into another. And this kind of adaptation doesn't always happen in a particularly different cultural context. When we see the anime adaptation of Fullmetal Alchemist, for instance, it's not really trying to tell the story in a new cultural context. There are only a few years difference between the manga and the anime series, so there's not much cultural difference to inform the adaptation. Rather, it was an attempt to tell a great story in a new medium. This accomplishes a few things, aside from the basic things that adaptation does in the first place. Firstly, it allows the story to be seen in a different way, which is it's a very exciting and potentially quite enriching experience for people who really appreciate the original story. But secondly, and most importantly, it allows the story to be retold using different tools and then presented to a new audience. Not everyone appreciates every artistic medium after all, so taking a story from one medium into another helps bring that story to an audience that may otherwise not have appreciated or even taken the time to experience it. This is a good thing, obviously. I mean, personally, being more of an anime fan than a manga fan, I know that I probably wouldn't have seen Fullmetal Alchemist if not for that adaptation, and it's a truly great story. I'm very glad I did. But this is where people tend to get kind of confused. People expect a movie to tell a story in the same way as a book, and when there are minor changes, they get all up in arms about them. It's important to understand what I said earlier. Adaptation is not simply reproduction. When telling a story in a different medium, the story is going to need to change to work with this new method of communication. I mean, books, movies, plays, video games, they're obviously all very different in how they tell their stories. So a story told the exact same way from one medium into another probably isn't going to come across quite correctly. So then, the goal here isn't to have 100% absolutely perfect faithfulness to the original work. Instead, it's to adapt that work to, well, work in a very different context of a new medium. Take Lord of the Rings. The films had a lot cut out from the books, and fans tended to be kind of upset about these things, but really, that was necessary. One could argue on some of the points, of course, but filmgoers would not have particularly enjoyed a half-hour break in Fellowship of the Ring while Sam and Frodo listened to songs and anecdotes from Tom Bombadil. I mean, a lot of critics thought Return of the King dragged on too long after the climax at Mount Doom as it was. Imagine if they adapted everything that happened in the book. The films didn't offer 100% accuracy, but that was for the best. Film does not lend itself to the kind of long-winded exposition the books so proudly employed. So alright, what does this have to do with video games? Well, I don't think I need to tell you that most attempts to adapt video games into other mediums have not been particularly successful, especially when it comes to film. And attempts to adapt stories from other mediums into video games are downright rare. Well, okay, except for a whole bunch of soulless attempts to just wring extra cash out of moviegoers, but I don't really think they count. This is why, for the next 2 episodes, we're going to be talking about the various ways that video games interact with other mediums. So more specifically, next week we're going to be talking about how video games adapt into other mediums, and the week after that we'll be talking about how other mediums adapt into video games. We're also going to be talking about some of the more important examples of this, as well as theorizing a bit about what more successful attempts might look like. Over the course of these episodes, we'll be talking about 3 types of adaptation: direct adaptation, indirect adaptation, and conceptual adaptation. Direct adaptation is the act of taking a story and retelling it in another medium, culture, or artistic light. Indirect adaptation is telling a new story in the same world as an existing one. Not a sequel, but a completely new story. And conceptual adaptation is taking the basic building blocks of a story and trying to make something entirely new out of it. We'll talk about all these over the course of the next couple weeks. My goal here is really just to get some real discussion going regarding adaptation in the context of video games, because most attempts to talk about this tend to be overshadowed by the sheer vast amount of bad adaptations we've had. So for now, go ahead and talk about it a bit in the comments, and next week we'll be talking about how video games adapt into other mediums. So until then, class dismissed.